I grew up in a part of the country where big square bill wooden crankbaits dominated the tournaments in the summertime. That's how just the majority of the tournaments were won that way. It was a way to catch, not necessarily get a lot of bites, but the way to catch bigger than average fish. It's funny how the tackle market has increased. Like I can remember times like on, everybody had pet square bills. They were made of wood. You had to go through 12 or 14 of them to get one that was right. You know, it's the perfect one to fish. And then all of a sudden you hit it on the side of the boat and they exploded, busted into 30,000 pieces, and you cried for a week. Then you'd have to go through a dozen more before you ever found one that had that action again. Well, one of the things that has changed now that they figured out how to make those same baits with plastic. The one thing that you give up with a plastic bait over a wooden bait is when fishing around really heavy cover like wood or whatever, that the wooden bait has a tendency to run soft. It goes back to what I talked about earlier. Sometimes we just have a tendency, you know, with our equipment is so good of being able to move that bait before that fish can completely eat it. Now there are days out there when they really want it, it don't matter what you do. You could tie it to the truck and they'll eat it. But more times than not, they lean more towards not biting as good. And so I figured out cranking shallow like that, cranking around wood, I don't get hung as much. I'm not trying to tear the bait out of anything. Now if I was cranking grass, it'd be just reverse. I'd want that no stretch line to rip that bait out of it. But around that wood, it's soft. It also, when you crank into a piece of wood, a lot of times that's when you get the bite. So many times I've caught big ones cranking wood and that bait will feel like it's hung. And what it is, I just pull that bait into that piece of wood and all of a sudden they pull back. I've caught that, probably that's one of my favorite deals is to crank in solid into a piece of wood. That's what makes you get the bite. If you're not deflecting, they got to be eating to get that bait if you're not deflecting, if that makes sense. Now when they're hungry, and a lot of times they'll tell you this, I'll throw past a piece of good cover regardless of what it is, and you crank 2 or 3 times, because normally you don't throw that far past it because you're working on that piece of cover. I'm not throwing from here to that light over there to come by that Coke bottle. There's that Coke bottle, so I'm throwing to his shirt, you know, so I can pinpoint and control. Then that way if I stay close like that, I can control that bait, you know, and make it go whichever way I want to. But the whole deal getting that fish to bite when they're not active, that's the cool thing about a square bill or shallow cranking in general with any kind of bait is I can make that fish bite when he's not feeding. So I can go to those shorter ones, I can use bigger hooks. The other deal with that is I can get that big hook closer to the bait. When he comes to it, he's coming all the way to the bait. You know what I'm saying? I don't need the hook hanging down that far. I've not accomplished anything by that. Also, that gives him more leverage. That longer hook sticking away from that bait, if he's only on one, when he jumps, he's got all that bait to work with flopping. That tighter hook, it won't move as much. But the other deal is about getting that big hook closer to the bait, so when I'm cranking through that wood or whatever, it's not hanging as bad. I mean, you're going to get hung shallow cranking there. I mean, that's the way it is. But I do think by going to the monofilament, and normally when I'm doing this, 20. I mean, I'm cranking with 20, at least 20-pound test. I'll crank with 25 if I thought I needed it. You know, because the other deal you run into, I feel like fluorocarbon is a lot more abrasion resistant than monofilament. Monofilament is soft. You know, so one thing when I do go to monofilament, I don't want to go too small on it because a 3 or 4 pounder seesawing on a piling with a barnacle on it snap you right off, you know. So I do like to lean more towards the bigger, and the only time I'm doing that is when I'm fishing, you know, relatively shallow and heavy cover. My casts are close and pinpoint. You know, accuracy is the deal, is to get that bait where I can manipulate it around that stuff.
It's Mike Iaconelli. This is Bass U TV.
Here's what's awesome about Bass U TV.
You get the top instructors.
You will learn things at Bass U that you will learn nowhere else.
We take the mystery and the myths out of bass fishing.
Real tools that help you catch more fish consistently.
At Bass U TV, shoes are optional.
And I like turtles.
And that's why you want to check out Bass U TV.
Join the Bass U family.
Welcome to Bass U TV.